Good morning, everyone. I'm John Sawyer, professor in the Department of Agronomy at Iowa State University. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning and to present some of our ongoing research related to nitrogen management and a little bit different crop for us than usual. I'd like to recognize a couple people at this point that are involved in the project. Camilla Martins is a graduate student. She's from Brazil and has been working with us in the project for the last couple of years, and we appreciate her being here and her time and effort. Mr. John Lundvall is a research associate in my program. He's worked with me for quite a few years, and it's great to have him involved in the project also. So the title of the presentation this morning is Nitrogen Use with Integrating Cereal Rye Production into a Soybean Corn System. I spend a lot of time working with nitrogen, both research and extension activities, and so my kind of main emphasis or interest is on the nitrogen side as we look at rye production. This project was funded by the Leopold Center, and this title is the project proposal that we submitted to the Leopold Center. It's a little bit different, and it kind of focuses a little more on the fact this is kind of an integrated production fertilization systems project. So that title is Integrating Rye Seed Production and Red Clover into Corn Systems and Nitrogen Management. And one of the reasons we were interested in this project was for the potential impact on nitrate loss reduction to water systems. And also it might be an opportunity to have another grain crop for Iowa producers that fits into their general production handling equipment. One of the things I wanted to make sure we're clear on as we start here, that we're not looking at a cover crop specifically with the rye, but growing rye as a grain or seed production system. And so that makes it just a little bit different, because we all tend to hear rye or winter rye or cereal rye and we immediately think of it only as a cover crop, but we're looking at it here as a production system and also the nitrogen requirement for growing rye. So why winter cereal rye grain production? Why that interest? Well, if we go back to the nutrient reduction strategy we have here in Iowa and look at a couple practices that are in field that have a large impact on nitrate loss, we can see that extended rotations is a 42% reduction. Now, extended rotations, we typically think more of those as having several years of say, alfalfa perennial crop in the system. So this is not exactly the same, but we are throwing red clover into the mix. And so with the rye, we're kind of considering that an extended rotation. Obviously, rye as a cover crop has a very large potential impact on nitrate loss reduction. So we're trying to produce a system where we can also produce the seed for that cover crop. And then nitrogen rate, while it's a lower percent reduction at 10%, when we think about a cereal crop, our expectation is that a small grains crop like rye would have a lower fertilization requirement than, say, a crop like corn, so we can have a impact on nitrate loss with a lower rate on that particular crop. So why the rye cereal grain production, and what would be the production potential? And so if we look at Iowa and we think of 22 million acres of corn and soybean, let's just assume that half of those acres, 11 million, would get a rye cover crop. That is a pretty lofty goal, but let's just make that assumption. And if we have 1 bushel of rye seeded as a cover crop, which is pretty typical of what we're thinking about now, but other folks are still looking at whether that bushel is required or not. And if we can produce 50 bushel per acre of rye grain, rye seed production, then we need about 220,000 acres of rye production to meet that requirement. Right now, of course, a lot of that production is happening outside of Iowa, and it will be interesting to see if this could move forward, how much of that production might move to Iowa versus bringing rye seed in from other states. So there's quite a bit of potential for needing rye seed. Well, if we look at the objectives of the project, we look and say, well, is there any research in Iowa on winter cereal rye and its response to N application? And I couldn't find any, and I really suspect there isn't. The data we have on crops like oats and winter wheat are very old, and so those are a couple other cereal crops that could use some research on nitrogen. Recent winter rye variety trials in Iowa have not generally applied any top dressing nitrogen fertilizer, so it's a question as to why that's happening. Northern Research Farm and the Northeast Research Farm has been conducting some work with the Iowa group and looking at the variety of trials, and so I'm kind of curious as to why there was no nitrogen applied there. And then what is the optimal nitrogen fertilization rate for winter rye grown in Iowa? And of course, that's one of our main objectives or curiosities for this study. This is kind of a timeline picture of our project and also a timeline for how we might keep a green cover on the landscape. So as we move from left to right, we start in this project with seeding the winter rye after soybean harvest. So that's going to happen sometime late September through October. We had a nitrogen application in the fall at seeding time, second nitrogen application in the spring at top dress time, and then we have the rye harvest, in our case, somewhere mid to late July. We also have a red clover seeding going in, we call a frost seeding, going in late March, both of the years of the study. And then the red clover is present through the winter, fall, the winter, and then into the next spring. And then we plant corn in generally late April, early May in the project. We apply some nitrogen at planting time, split that nitrogen then with the second application about the V4 growth stage, and then we have corn growing, and then we harvest the corn. So as we look across that timeline, we basically have something alive and growing on that landscape during that whole time frame. And then at the bottom there, you can see we have what we call the green cover going on, and so we've got something alive and maybe dormant in the wintertime, but alive through that time period with roots that are active. Now, in a project, we did not follow that from corn harvest on to soybean planting, but we have a lot of research on using a cover crop after corn harvest and before soybean, and so we could add a cover crop of some sort after the corn harvest and then continue that green cover and have that as a continuous green cover on the landscape. It's kind of an old school project. We've looked at small grains before. We've looked at red clover as an interseeding into a small grain, so that's not really new. The cereal rye is somewhat more of a newer crop potential for Iowa, but we're trying to keep a handle on that nitrate that we might lose out of the soil system and a different production system to look at that. Many businesses are also very interested in the environment, and I just pulled this example off the internet. This is from General Mills, their responsibility focus, and they have 6 core principles of regenerative agriculture. And if we look at the little diagram there, we can see that they talk about understanding your soil and understanding your farming operation and what context you have going on, looking at your production practices, looking at how you might maximize productivity, keeping the soil covered, keeping something live, growing and having roots in the soil system, and then also integrating with the livestock. Now, while in our project we did not have livestock directly, we do have the red clover as a potential grazing or feedstock. We did bale the rye straw, and so that's something that could go into the livestock system. So our project kind of fits into this type of an idea where we're looking at different ways of managing the landscape for our crop production, our soil resource, and also water quality. So we had 2 phases into the project. As you can probably figure it out by now, we have the first phase is the rye production, and I'll either call it winter rye or silver rye. It's the same thing, but we're looking at that winter rye production. So in the upper left picture is the planting of the rye following soybean harvest, and we used a no-till drill for that seeding. The second picture then is the fall growth. In our 2 years of the study, we had some wet conditions, later soybean harvest, so our planting 3 out of the 4 years was a little later than I would like, and so sometimes our fall rye growth was very small, but winter rye is very winter hardy, and even if all we had was a little coleoptile showing, that plant survived and then it grew the next year. I'll talk about some differences between the 2 rye varieties we used, but generally we did have survival in each of the years of the study. The third picture there is just a look at the early spring regrowth from the rye. The fourth picture is a shot of full head emergence, and the person standing there is Camilla Martin. She's the graduate student, and the rye is a fairly tall crop, at least the varieties that we used. Then at the bottom we have the rye harvest going on, and generally that was mid to later July for us. And then we did bale the straw off the field, off the study sites after harvest. And then the next shot is a picture of the clover growth. And we had some really good conditions for growing clover in our 2 years. We had adequate rainfall after the rye was harvested, so we had a really good chance for that clover to grow. And during the first part of the growing season, the clover growth is very small, and we'll talk about this later, that we really didn't see an impact on the rye from the clover. And then the last picture in the bottom right is the clover in late fall or early fall or late summer. You can see a little butterfly sitting on the bloom, so there are some benefits that come from the clover rather than just as a potential nitrogen source. And we did not mow the clover. We mowed the rye stubble where there was not clover. We did not mow the clover. We could have done that. We had such good growth, we could have actually harvested that clover in late August, early September. But our goal for the project was to kind of call this a cover crop with the clover, and so we just left it and did not mow. Mowing could help a little with some weed issues you might get in that clover growth, but we had really excellent clover growth during the study. The second phase then is the corn phase, and so we left the clover grow. We did not kill it in the fall, again trying to have living roots through the fall, winter, and early spring. We did not get a lot of spring regrowth. You can see that in the upper left picture. We were generally controlling the clover in later April. We didn't really want to limit corn planting, so we kind of took the idea that we would control the clover early, so we got some regrowth. The next picture is actually a side-by-side of the volunteer rye and clover. And we didn't see much volunteer rye in the fall, but it certainly was there in the spring. And rye will tiller considerably, so we had these little clumps of rye where we had some rye seed fall out of the combine. I don't think we had a lot of seed loss, but there was certainly some there, and so we actually had a little bit of a cover crop without the clover. And then we planted the corn no-till, and then the far right picture is the corn growing in the clover strip. And we had good stands, whether it was with or without the clover. We really had good stands and never had an impact of the clover or the volunteer rye on stand. It was very, very uniform. So we ran this study at 2 locations, Kanawha Research Farm in northern Iowa and the AEA farm here west of Ames. Our rye production years were 2018 and 2019, and the corn was 2019 and 2020. And we had at each of the locations a new site each of those years. So we started the project with our fall rye seeding in the fall of 2017. We had 2 rye varieties, ND Dillon and Elbin. I'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. We frost seeded ruby red clover generally in the latter part of March when we were still getting some frost, but the spring was coming. We had 6 nitrogen rates on the rye, 0 to 125 pounds of N per acre is treated urea, urease treated urea. We put 25 pounds on at planting and the remainder in the spring at top dress as the rye was beginning to green up. In our corn, our nitrogen rate response following the rye and clover was 6 N rates from 0 to 250 pounds of N per acre. And we had 50 pounds at planting time and the remainder at the V4 growth stage, and again it was treated urea. We had 2 varieties that we used for the rye. ND Dillon is a release from North Dakota in 2016. We kind of called that our northern variety. As you can tell from the year, it's a fairly new variety that was released in the last few years. Elbin is an older variety released from Oklahoma in 1956, and we kind of called that our southern variety. And at least in the research arena, we seem to have a lot of people using that Elbin as a cover crop, so it seemed to be fairly popular. So we wanted to have a variety in the types of rye that we use, and so we had kind of the northern and the southern. And I'll talk about the Elbin and some issues we had with stand establishment with that particular variety. We drilled the rye following soybean harvest, 7.5-inch row spacing. We seeded at 1.1 million pure live seed per acre, so we were not trying to go off of a bushel basis, but actually when we get into small grain seeding, we like to think about how many seeds per acre that we're planting. So that meant the Elbin went at about 48 pounds per acre and the ND Dillon about 71 because of the difference in seed size. And the Ruby Red Clover was frost seeded at about 15 pounds of pure live seed per acre, and with the purity and et cetera, that went in at about 19 pounds of seed per acre. We did some canopy sensing to take a look at nitrogen response in both the rye and the corn. We used a rapid scan, a CS45 sensor from Holland Scientific, and we measured the NIR, the red band, and the red edge band. And we also used a handheld Minolta SPAD meter to measure the chlorophyll greenness of the crops. The rye we sensed at the joining stage, the boot flag stage, and also the full heading stage. Corn we sensed at the V9 growth stage, and then we did the Minolta SPAD meter reading on the ear leaf at the R1 silking stage. In the rye, we measured the stand, the height, and the lodging, and the grain yield, and we also measured the post-rye harvest soil profile Nitrate-N in the top 2 feet of soil. If you're not real familiar with small grain growth staging, I mentioned a couple staging then, and so we measured the canopy sensing at that joining stage, about the middle there, about stage 6 and 7 on the Feek scale, and then we had full flag leaf emergence in that boot stage, and then the last measurements were done when we had full heading over there, about 10.5 stage on the Feek scale. So just a little idea of what those stages look like. And the small grains just keep growing. They grow rapidly in the spring. A lot of growth happens in May, and so it's a pretty quick sequence through those growth stages in the May timeframe. We're going to talk about the rye results across sites, years, and red clover. And the red clover had no effect on the rye, and so we didn't see any effect, so we average across that. And we did see differences between the rye varieties, and so we're going to summarize and talk about the results by the rye variety. I have several slides here that are set up in a similar fashion. So we have a graphic on the left that gives the response to nitrogen application rate, and then the table on the right gives the point where we reach what we call the agronomic optimum N rate. That's what AONR stands for. And then also where the response plateaued out, in this case heads per acre, and where we maximized, in this case, the number of heads per acre. So the graphic is N rate applied, total N on the bottom, 0 to 125 pounds of N per acre. And then the vertical axis on the graphic is heads per acre times 10,000 or millions of heads. And you can see, because we get tillering in a small grain, you can see the number of heads increase as the N rate. So the plant was responding to the nitrogen, and there was more tillering, so we end up with more heads per acre than the seeding rate, which is typical. We get a lot of tillering in the fall, and unfortunately we had that pretty limited in our study. You will get a little bit of tillering in the spring, and you can see how the both rye varieties responded to that nitrogen rate as far as tillering. As I mentioned, the Elbin had some issues with stand establishment, and here you can see the number of heads per acre are higher with the ND Dillon than the Elbin. And I don't know if it was seed quality or the fact the Elbin is a southern variety and didn't survive the winter quite as well, or didn't tiller as well, but generally the head count was less with the Elbin. We'll see this in the sensing also. And our agronomic optimums were just a little over 100 pounds of N per acre. This is the Rye Plant Height at full head emergence and full height. Again, height is the vertical axis on the graphic, and not a lot of height difference either between the varieties or response to nitrogen. There was a slight increase in height with nitrogen application, but it was really quite small, and it plateaued out at about 50 pounds of N per acre. And both the varieties were about the same. Rye tends to be kind of tall, and so we're looking 54, 56 inches of height. And as I'll mention later, it would be nice if we had some rye varieties that were just a little bit on the shorter side and a little more stiff-strawed. The lodging score, this is a very general, rough estimate of lodging. We did this as a scale of 0 to 2, so 0 was absolutely no lodging, 2 would have been fully flat, and we never had the fully flat. But we did see some lodging in the different plots, and it would be the wind would kind of seem to whip the plants around, and there'd be some partial lodging, so we kind of ended up at about midway on the lodging. Both varieties had the same lodging score. You can see the lodging did increase with nitrogen rate, and that's one of the worries with a small grain, that if we have too much nitrogen there, you get too much growth, and then you'll have lodging of the small grain. So it did have an impact, and it maxed out at about 84 pounds of N per acre. So some lodging took place. That was to be expected, and we did see that increase somewhat with the nitrogen application rate. We did the canopy sensing, as I mentioned, at 3 stages. So we have 3 graphs here. The left graph is at the joining stage, the middle graph is at the boot stage, and then the right graph is at full head emergence. And as I mentioned before, the Elbin just did not have quite the stand early in the season as the ND Dillon, and you can see in this case we're looking at NDVI, or normalized difference vegetative index, quite lower NDVI values with the Elbin than the ND Dillon. And NDVI is it's been around a long time, that index. It's a good indicator of plant growth, somewhat also the nitrogen status, and you can see the difference in the early stages, how the Dillon had better biomass. The plants did respond to nitrogen, so we know we're getting a increase in plant growth and then potential productivity with the nitrogen. Both the sensing stage at jointing and the sensing at the boot stage, we can see that increase of the plant biomass within application, and generally 80, 90 pounds of N per acre is where we tended to max out that canopy sensing. And then at the head emergence, the plants are fully developed, the heads are out, and the difference between the varieties disappeared. And again, there was a response to the nitrogen rate, but the value or the difference in that sensing between N rates was much smaller than earlier in the season. So we had some either full canopy or saturation of the sensing system, or the head interfering with that biomass sensing, and it kind of disappeared at the full head emergence. But it generally a good response to nitrogen application from the rye. Of course, one of the things we really get interested in is the grain yield. And so again, you've got yield in bushels per acre on the vertical axis, and total N applied on the x-axis. The yield was quite different between the 2 varieties. The plateau yield for the ND Dillon was about 50 bushels per acre, and the plateau yield for the Elbin about 34 bushels per acre, so quite a difference in the productivity level. The agronomic optimum N rate for both of the varieties was in that 85 to 89 pounds of N per acre, so quite similar. We do see this happening in corn, where the nitrogen rate does not tie directly to the yield level, and it's happening again here with the rye seed production, where there was major difference in the yield levels, but the optimal N rate was quite similar. If you've noticed on these graphs, the N response is pretty linear, and then it reaches a plateau, and we see that also here with the yield. So if you want to think about an economic optimum N rate, the slopes of those lines are enough that the economic optimum falls at that join point or at the agronomic optimum. So across this study and in these years of production, our economic optimum N rates would be in that mid 80 to high 80 pound of N per acre range. That what would be considered an economical application rate. So we did show that rye does respond for grain production to nitrogen application, and that we now have some idea of where that fertilization rate maybe should be when it follows soybean, and we certainly did not see an increase in yield when we went beyond those optimal N rates. We did look at the soil profile Nitrate-N following the rye harvest, and this is important to see how much nitrate might be left in the soil profile. We have 3 N rates we measured, 0, 75, and 125 pounds of N per acre. We sampled the top foot and then the second foot, so we went down to a total 2-foot profile. The concentrations of Nitrate-N are there for each of the two different depths for the 3 N rates, and then the right column is the profile sum across the 2 feet, 17, 18, and 21 pounds of Nitrate-N per acre with those 3 N rates. So a slight increase in Nitrate-N in the profile within application, that would be expected. These amounts and concentrations are really quite low, and that 75-pound rate is pretty close to our optimal N rate, and that was only a 1 pound N per acre increase. So as I kind of expected, and what's good for a cereal crop is to have the low nitrate following the harvest, so we are not carrying a lot of nitrate in the profile after the rye has been harvested. So a summary of the rye production phase of the study. Winter cereal rye consistent responded to N rate, canopy, stand count, head count, height, and grain yield. We had no effect of the underseeded red clover on the rye production, and that would be, I think, pretty much expected because the clover growth is really small. It's under that rye canopy, so it's got a lot of competition, but then it really takes off once the rye is harvested. The plant stand and canopy was greater with ND Dillon than Elbin, so it's definitely some varietal difference there. And the AONR, however, was pretty similar for both of those, average at 87 pounds of N per acre, 85 and 89 for the two different varieties, so fairly consistent on that optimal nitrogen application rate for the rye. Our post-harvest rye soil nitrate was not affected by the presence of red clover. Again, its growth is very small, generally after or at the time of the rye harvest, so there was no impact of the rye or of the red clover, excuse me, at that time, but certainly would later as the growth continued through the summer. The nitrate concentration following the rye harvest, the profile depth was really quite low, and near the ONR was only 1 pound N per acre compared to the no N applied, and so that's a good thing as far as helping to reduce nitrate loss from the profile. Let's move over then to the corn nitrogen response results. Again, these are summarized here by site or across sites and years. We definitely had a clover effect, so we wanted to take a look at with and without the red clover on nitrogen response in the corn. I have two graphs here. Again, set up similar as before. You've got the total N applied on the x-axis in pounds per acre. The left graph is the canopy sensing. In this case, we're looking at an index called NDRE. It's the same basically as NDVI, except we use the red edge band to calculate the canopy sensing index. And then on the right is the SPAD readings at the R1 growth stage of the ear leaf. Early on, that left graph, we did that sensing at the V9 stage. It's a little bit early. If we had sensed maybe at the V12, 14 stage, we might have gotten a little more differential in the corn response to the clover. But if you look over at the 0 N rate, you can see that the corn was beginning to respond to nitrogen supplied from the clover, and then that disappeared pretty quickly. We did not kill the clover in the fall. We killed it in the spring. We planted no-till with a fair amount of residue, and so the mineralization rate of the clover would be fairly slow, would be my guess, in that springtime period. And that's kind of reflected in that NDRE values and the low differential between the corn with and without the clover. And the SPAD meter readings on the right, we're now at the silking stage, so we've had more time for the nitrogen to get mineralized out of the clover, and you can see at the 0 N rate and the two lowest N rates, a quite higher SPAD value for the corn following the clover, which is that top dash line, and you can see that the clover is definitely supplying nitrogen to the corn crop, and it's responding to that nitrogen. So again, from many years of older research, we would expect to see that type of response out of the clover. The corn yield did respond to fertilizer N rate. You can see the very large yield increase in nitrogen application. As we saw with the SPAD meter readings and the canopy sensing, there was a yield boost in the corn from the clover. If you look again at the 0 N rate and the two lower N rates, you can see the top dark line is from the corn following the clover, red clover, and it's a much higher yield, meaning it's getting nitrogen out of that clover system. And then when we have adequate fertilizer N applied, the yields are pretty similar between with and without the clover. A little bit higher yield with the corn following, with corn not following clover versus corn following clover, but pretty similar. There's a couple different ways to estimate the nitrogen supply from that red clover. One is to pick the economic optimum N rate from with and without the clover. And you can see those numbers there on the graphic. 203 pounds of N per acre without clover, 153 with clover. That's a 50 pound N per acre difference, meaning then that the clover was supplying approximately 50 pounds of N to the corn across those sites and those years. And that seems to me to be about what I would think would be a normal response. We did have some difference between the locations, not a large difference, but the northern side at Kanawha tended to have a little bit lower N supply than the site here at Ames. And again, that would be somewhat expected as we get into warmer springtime conditions and maybe more mineralization out of the clover residue. If you think about, is that 50 pounds enough to pay for the nitrogen supplied by the clover? So if we would use 40 cents per pound of N, that's $20 per acre. We seeded at 19 pounds of clover seed per acre, and we paid $2.80 per pound. That's $53, so we're not going to cover the seed cost alone with the nitrogen response. But there are other positives that come out of the clover, as we've talked about before. Other positive things for the soil, a growing crop there during fall through winter and early spring, reducing nitrate loss, wildlife benefits, things like that, so we can account for some other benefits out of that clover. So an overall summary then to the project. We did prove that rye responded in application. We kind of knew that, but a lot of times in Iowa we'll talk about or hear people talk about growing oats or other small grains, and they tend not to say, well, we don't need to fertilize those. So we wanted to make sure if that was true for rye or whether we needed to apply nitrogen. In our study, we found an optimal N rate of about 87, mid 80 pound N per acre range, and we did do a split fall spring. The reason we did the split was to make sure that we got good fall growth. I don't know if we got full benefit out of that in our studies because we didn't get a lot of fall growth, but it is important to have some nitrogen there in the fall for a fall seeded small grain. And then we top dressed the rest in the spring at green up. We did not have any effect of the rye clover underseeded on the rye production itself, and the red clover effect was there in the succeeding corn crop with a mean 50 pound N per acre equivalent supply of nitrogen to the corn and minimal to no impact on the corn yield. There's still a lot of other things that could be studied related to rye seed production, as we would for any crop, and so hopefully there will be more research in the future looking at rye as a grain crop for production in Iowa. I think there is potential for the rye clover integration into a soybean corn system. We do need to make that work well for Iowa production and Iowa profitability in our crop production system, so there's probably some more work to be done there. It would be nice to get higher rye yields and better standability, and there are variety trials going underway looking at that as for different options. It is nice to have this system keep a green cover on the landscape to help with things like nitrate loss. I think it could be some helpful things there also for soil erosion control. And also the rye seed production is a fairly low N rate requirement crop, and so that helps also on the nitrate. And then, as I mentioned, some other benefits from the clover for the soil and wildlife. I just want to acknowledge the funding from the Leopold Center that translated then over to the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, so we really appreciate the funding for this project. Gave us a chance to look at something different and a really good study for the graduate student. I'd like to thank the research farm staff, both here at the agronomy farm and ag bioscience and engineering farm, and also at the Northern Research Farm. Dr. Antonio Mallarino is a co-PI on the project, so I appreciate his help. And then Lewis Thompson, that works with Dr. Mallarino, helped with the project also, so we appreciate his efforts in the project. Thank you very much.